Do they charge you to?
No. Okay. We are in the middle of chapter 6. I think this is our, we're definitely on at least the third or fourth class on chapter 6. We're going quite slowly because the concepts are quite difficult. We explained last time, we used a metaphor to explain the way in which God does not change in the creation of the world. How does God not change in the creation of the world? Well, there's a whole process we've been describing. We described the process of creation, which involved the emanation of the light, and then the contraction, and then the shining of the ray into the remnant of what was left over from the light that was there before. The ray being the kav, and the remnant being the reshimu, and the kav is the source for the light, and the reshimu is the source for the vessels that we've been discussing in all our previous classes. We explained with a metaphor from a blind man, right? We explained with a metaphor from someone that cannot see. Good evening. How it is that the contraction does not change God at all, right? We explained this at we explained it at two levels, ultimately, right? Near the end of the class, we explained it at a higher level. That was the parentheses that we ended on. We're on page 180. At the beginning of in the beginning and the middle of last week's class, we spoke about how the contraction makes no difference to God himself, right? There's different levels. The contraction is the tzimtzum. The tzimtzum is the removal of God's light, right? Essentially, the entire process of creation is through the tzimtzum, is through the contraction, right? Everything else, in terms of the creation of the world, is all about the God's light and an expression of God. So the question was, how could it be that if God's light is contracted and removed, there's no change from before the creation of the world, let's say before the 6 days of creation, whatever before might mean, whatever before time means as an idea, let's say at least theoretically, if there were a time before, right? There was God in a certain state, and afterwards we say that nothing has changed. How can it be that nothing has changed in the creation of the entire universe? And the answer is because all of the changes, it comes about in his light, right? It is God's light. It is God's expression. It is his expression of himself through which he creates the world. It is God's expression that becomes the world, that becomes the universe. Now, we say, but God's expression changes. God's expression is removed, and then there's something left over, and then a little bit more is expressed, right? His expression is basically reduced from everything that God is, and an expression of of everything that God can do, to a very limited creation, which is the defined nature of our world, and all the definition that everything has in our world. We explained that really there's no difference, because the contraction, the tzimtzum, is loy kipshutai, is non-literal, right? How is it non-literal? There's a couple of different levels. The first thing is that it makes no difference to God. God himself certainly does not change. What was the example we gave of God does not change? We said it's like a blind man, right? The soul, the expression of God's light, we said, is somewhat like the soul's expression within the body. It's like the person's ability to see, right? If you have a blind man, technically they can't see. And you would say that the blind man is different than the man that can see. But the truth is that the average blind man can have children that can see. We said, what does this reflect? What's this strange idea that a blind man can have children that can see? It means that in essence he isn't changed, right? In essence, in his fundamental humanity, in his fundamental potential and form as a human being, he still can see. His inability to see personally is so to speak, technical fact, something that happens to be true. He happens to right now not be expressing his ability to see, but his ability to see is exactly as it was before. It's rather than expressing itself in his ability to see out into the world, it remains in potential. It remains contained within his own soul. It's not expressed. It's not expressed in a way that he can interact with the world outside of himself. But the potential is still there, and the proof that it's still there is that he can have children that can see. Right? We said similarly, the tzimtzum is a similar idea. The light is removed. The light no longer shines outward into the void. The light is, where does the light go? The light returns to within God Himself. The light is no longer expressed outward, but is only expressed inward, whatever that means. Right? This is all obviously metaphorical. We can't think too physically, but nevertheless, this is the metaphor. The light is expressed inward and not outward. But God Himself does not change, because all it is it's a limitation on how far the expression goes. That's all it is. But fundamentally, the expression is still there. The expression is the same. It just doesn't go as far as out into the world. It only is expressed within Himself. So God Himself does not change. But then you could say, but the light changes, because before the light was going outward, and now the light is only confined within God. There's a change in the light, right? The tzimtzum affects the light. And we said in the parentheses at the end of last week's class, I gave a very brief explanation, but we said in the parentheses at the end of last week's class that even for the light there's no tzimtzum. Why not? Because this whole dichotomy of within God and outside of God is itself not really talking about God Himself. It's talking about something called the luminary. It's talking about some lower level at which there is such an idea as something existing outside of God, where we know that in truth, in the deepest truth, obviously nothing can exist outside of God. Obviously there is no existence external to Him. He is simply everywhere by nature of His being. The simple way of being everywhere, the way the children sing in school, Hashem is here, Hashem is there, Hashem is truly everywhere, right? And since He is everywhere, the expression outside of Him and the expression within Him are basically identical. In other words, the light was really expressed within Him the entire time. It's a misconception to think that the light ever leaves Him, because Hamoed Hu B'Is Galus, the source of the light, the luminary Himself, God Himself, is really everywhere, as we explained in the parentheses last time. So long story short, there's no difference in Him, and there's no difference in the light. Right? So what is there difference? So what is the creation of the entire universe? The creation of the entire universe is essentially in our perspective, in the perspective of the receiver. It's only in the perspective of the creation that the universe is actually literally created. In God's perspective, it's the tzimtzum is loy kapshuta. The contraction of His light is non-literal. The creation of the universe doesn't change anything at all to Him. It's from His perspective, nothing has changed. His light is shining exactly as it was before. There's no change in Him. There's no change in His light. The only change that there is that the creation, there's room for a creation to perceive that they're separate from God. That's the only thing that really happens quote unquote happens in the creation of the world. What is it? What is a contradiction?
That nothing can exist outside of Him, and yet He lets us
perceive.
So
it's only perception.
It's
only a perception. The creation. It's not just us. As we're going to talk about today, it's not just us. It's really the entire creation. We're the prime example, and it's very Chassidic actually to realize that the human being in this world, and the Jew specifically, is really the real reason for all of this. But ultimately, even the vessels of Atzilus, even the Kalim, have this have some sort of at least connection to this perspective, as we're going to discuss tonight. We're on page 180, 4 lines down. V'hineh. From the constricted ray that we talked about before, this is the ray that's left over when the light is removed. We're talking about the reshimu, the remnant of God's light that's left over from when He contracts it, from when He brings it within Himself, so to speak. From this ray, this is where the vessels of Atzilus come from. Again, Atzilus is a reminder. Atzilus is the highest of the 4 spiritual worlds, which we know. There's Atzilus, which means the world of emanation, emanation as in light, right? As in rays. That's connected to what we're talking about. You have Bria, which is the world of creation. You have Yetzira, which is the world of formation, and then you have Asiya, which is the world of action. And it is the physical component of the lowest world of action where we live. The physical universe is the lowest part of the world of action. So you have 4 worlds, basically. Really, these are only categories of worlds. There's many levels and distinctions to be drawn within these things, to the extent that you can really say that there's infinite worlds in each category. But the generally speaking, in the simple form, there's 4 worlds. the highest of the spiritual worlds is what, good evening, is what we talk about in Chassidus a lot, because the highest of the four spiritual worlds, as we learned earlier in this discourse, is where God and limitation touch. It's how there's able to be an infinite God interacting with a limited creation, and the infinite God does not become finite, and the limited creation does not become God, and yet the two are able to interact. That's fundamentally what happens in the highest world, in the world of Atzilus. We're on page 180, 4 lines down. So it is the vessels, right? And every world has spheres. Every world is created with through intermediaries, through, so to speak, the tools by which God creates the world. These are called spheres. And the spheres of Atzilus all spheres are created of a soul and a body, or more commonly, lights and vessels. This should all sound like review. The vessels are what's created from the reshimu, from the ray of light that's left over when God contracts his infinite light, right? As we explained, we said God and his infinite light exist and fill the void, whatever that means. God contracts his light, and what's left over when he contracts his light is the reshimu, which means the remnant. This remnant is itself, so we said, such a lesser form of his infinite light that it could actually be considered even as finite in comparison to his true infinite light before he removes it. All right? Keeping in mind as we go along that all of this is non-literal, right? Based on last week's class, as I said before, all of this, when we say he removed his light, where does he remove his light from and to? He removes his light from within himself to within himself, right? And the question becomes, what difference does it make? And the answer is very little to God or the light. The difference is mainly to the creation. Okay. So, the vessels of Atzilus are created from this remnant. V'reishisan ha'chachma. The highest of the 10 spheres, the highest of the 10 intermediaries, the 10 means by which God relates to the world, is called chachma. Chachma is normally translated in English as wisdom.
But you don't like it.
What?
You don't like the translation.
I think wisdom is fine.
Which one you don't like?
It doesn't convey none of the English translations convey the real
essence. Yeah.
The real implication of the term. When we say there's chachma in Atzilus, what do we mean? Right? We've had this discussion before. We don't mean that there's wisdom as we understand wisdom. We mean that there's something that God does. It is an expression of God that is purely godly, and yet this is the source in a very removed way for what we call wisdom, right? As we're gonna discuss further. But it's not wisdom. It's not it itself. If we could see it, we would not recognize it as wisdom as we understand it in our world, right? If you'll recall, this is the wisdom in Atzilus is what the Rambam calls the knower, the knowledge, and the known all as one, right? This is the highest conception of God that one can arrive to intellectually, which is that he simply is God, and by dint of being an infinite God, and Godding, right, is how we described it in previous classes. So by the verb of being God, by the act of being God, he automatically knows. This is one of the 10 things that he automatically does. He has an automatic expression of chachma simply by being God. So it's not knowing in the way we normally think of it. It's not knowing in a human sense. It's knowing in a very profound godly sense in such a way that if we saw it, we wouldn't even know it was. We wouldn't even necessarily recognize it as chachma, as wisdom. Im heyes, even though she'inyana b'chinas habittul, the idea of chachma, of wisdom, is bittul. Bittul is translated as nullification, right? In the revealed levels of the Torah, we have bittul. We have like food is batal b'shishin, right? If you have a drop of milk that falls into the cholent, right? The fleishik cholent, and the question is, does the cholent is the cholent considered a mixture of meat and milk, right? Really, gets more complicated if the drop of milk falls into something else, and then something else falls into the cholent, right? That's another famous. But the question is, generally speaking, the rule is batal b'shishim, right? 60 times. If you have 60 times, then the taste becomes nullified. It's considered as if it's not there, right? And therefore, you can sometimes avoid having to throw the cholent out because there's 60 times more cholent than whatever you put in there. It's as if the taste is nullified. Is the halachic idea of bittul. But we have in Chassidus the idea of bittul. If you could say, I've heard it said before, that if there is one fundamental concept of Chassidus, it is bittul. It is the idea of nullification. What does nullification mean? It means that something is to some extent or another, because there's different types of bittul, is in one way or another, to some extent or another, dependent on something else. The opposite of bittul is yeshus, which means independence, an independent existence. Bittul is dependence. It's a dependent existence, right? But there's many different forms of dependent existence. Dependent sometimes has the wrong connotation, even though it's the correct word, I think. For example, if you have a page full of text, the letters are buttal to the meaning of the text. The letters are subjugated; they're dependent on the meaning of the text. The letters point to and are about the meaning of the text. Even though if someone comes along and they don't say read the language, you can still see the letters, even though you don't understand the meaning. So on the other hand, the letters have an independent existence of the meaning, right? But to some extent, they have a dependent existence of the meaning. And all of Chassidus, in some ways, you could say, is a study of the dependence of things upon other things. Usually the dependence of something upon God, to different extents in different ways. And really, the sphira, where the highest expression of the human soul that can be called something that the human soul does, is bittul. Is dependence, is becoming part of something larger than oneself, right? It's like if you think about this is the chachma, right? Like for example, just a very sort of silly example, but let's say you have a shliach of the Rebbe, right? The Rebbe sends a rabbi out to go and come to Georgia and to make a home for Jews here. He makes a Chabad house, and he provides Jewish services, and he kashers kitchens, and he puts up mezuzahs, and he does all these things, right? So the rabbi, when he's here, right, he is here, and he affects his surroundings. However, the rabbi eventually, if he's here for too long, can sometimes get burnt out. He gets affected by his surroundings too much. He starts to think, what am I doing here? Why am I in Georgia? These people are crazy. Why should I even deal with them? So what does he have to do? He has to go back to his source. He has to go back to something higher. He has to go back to New York, to the Rebbe, for example, and recharge his batteries. Right? This is the example that's famously given by many mashpiyim. It's an example for a few different things, but the general idea is that chachma, the highest capacity of the human soul, is to attach oneself to something higher than oneself, to attach oneself to the truth. The rabbi is in his highest form, not when he is here speaking to people who are, so to speak, lower than him, at a lower level Judaically or lower in knowledge. He is at his highest point when he is himself subjugated and connected. He ceases to be a rabbi and becomes a student of someone who knows more than he does. Right? This general thrust, this general idea is chachma. Chachma is bittul. There's lots of things that are bittul, but chachma, in terms of the soul's expression, is bittul. It is becoming dependent on something higher than oneself. It is the essence of intelligence. This is what intelligence is by nature, right? The essence of intelligence. Once you get past the analytic intellect, which is more properly described by bina, the lower of the the second of the three intellectual spheres. Bina is analysis, when you understand different ideas and how they work together. Chachma is the underlying order that's within everything, so to speak. It points to a higher place. It's the underlying truth, the essence of the thought, the essence that gives form to the analysis, what the analysis is part of, what the analysis points toward, you could say, is something like chachma. This is the highest thing that the human soul can do, at least as an independent power. There's other things. You could say ratzon and tainug are higher. That's a discussion for a different time. The highest capacity of the soul is chachma. And chachma is bittul. Chachma is dependence. The entire idea, the highest form of wisdom, is for you to disappear entirely and become one with the thought. That's the highest form of wisdom. Chachma by nature is bittul. Is dependence.
Is bittul is nullification.
Yeah, correct.
Nullification in this case
means that the person themselves disappears.
Non-independence.
No, dependence. Non-independence, correct.
There's no
Dependence,
gap whatsoever.
correct, absolutely. So even though Chachma is bittul, that was just a little summary on Chachma. Even though Chachma is bittul, even though Chachma is nullification, ki Chachma keach ma, as we see from its name, because Chachma is formed of the letters keach ma, which means the power of what. In other words, what is even here? The ability to not be, the ability to disappear completely and become totally subjugated to something else, nullified before a higher truth. Yes, is the keach ma, the potential, the power of what? Literally, the question word what? The power of becoming nothing. Keach ma. Shehu b'chinas haskala eichsha ein sof ulevadehu. And what is the highest chachma? What is the chachma of Atzilus? Think about what is God's wisdom's understanding that the infinite God is the only one. He is the only true existence. Right. In other words, what is the highest intellect occupied? It is occupied with the idea that the only thing that really exists is God. V'chein kol hakelim da'atzilus, and so too, all of the vessels of Atzilus are in some way bottled to God. Chachma is the so to speak the right. All of the spheres exist both in general and specific form. Right. So you have Chachma. But Chachma contains within it all the other spheres. There's Chesed of Chachma, there's Gvura of Chachma, there's kindness of Chachma, there's severity of Chachma, right? So all of the spheres have Chachma. All of the spheres have Bittul. It's just Chachma that is the representative. What part of all the spheres is this Bittul? That part is Chachma, if that makes any sense. If you don't understand what I just said, it doesn't matter. It's parenthetical. So Chachma and all of the spheres, all 10, are batul to Hashem. They're all about nullification to God. Nevertheless, they are a defined and limited existence. As you see from the very fact that they have names. One is Chachma, which means wisdom. One is Chesed, which means kindness. One is Gvura, which is severity. They have 10 different names. What does 10 different names imply? That you have 10 different things. Right? In other words, these are not all one thing. There actually are 10 different expressions of God, even though I should point out that to us it's a very, very abstract difference. The difference is subtle in a way to our understanding. In other words, if you went there and you saw it, like I told you before, you would see merely God expressing himself, and you wouldn't be able to, it would be very hard unless you were very refined to see the differences, so to speak, in the perhaps in the way that God expresses himself. But nevertheless,
are these like personality traits?
In the human being, they're personality traits in a sense. In a sense, I wouldn't call it. Our personality traits is a very the wishy-washy term. Anything's a personality trait. I like long walks on the beach as a personality trait. The spheres in a person are I would say they're the 10 means by which the soul expresses itself. Are these spheres? An individual personality trait, like I don't like go walking on the beach, or I like chocolate ice cream, or something like that, is a composite of the spheres, right? Just like I gave the example in a previous class, the spheres themselves are like primary colors. Everything else is a composite, right? It's the different colors mixed together to form a specific shade or a specific reality. Everything in our world is like that. Everything that has a limited and defined existence is a composite and a mix, so to speak, of the 10 spheres, and different affecting themselves in different ways. So what's the bottom line here? The bottom line is that all 10 spheros are batal to God. All 10 spheros are nullified before God. They all stand before God, so to speak. They all contemplate God. They are contained within themselves. They are expressions of God. What is the wisdom of Chachma? The wisdom of Chachma is the wisdom of realizing that there's only one God. What's the love of Chesed of Atzilus? The love of Chesed of Atzilus is the love of the Creator, right? And his love towards everything that exists. What is the severity of Gvura of Atzilus? The severity of the Gvura of the Gvura is God's ability to control himself and contain himself, right? Or perhaps even punish the wicked, right? And things like that. In other words, all of these are expressions of God. These are not things that if you see them, you would say, oh, that's a separate and independent existence. Quite on the contrary. These are things which express God to the extent that we say that it's God's wisdom, right? Nevertheless, they are 10 individual things, and therefore they're incommensurate to his essence. As we said before, they come from the Rishimu, which itself is incommensurate even to God's original light. Right? So in other words, we understand that the limitations of the vessels of Atzilus are very far removed from God's essence, which is really the point that Tzemach Tzedek is bringing out in this. It's one sentence I've been explaining for 15 minutes. The Sphirus, even though they are bottled to God, even though they are still a ray of his original light, they are something that is, they come from the Rishimu, that is left over from God's original infinite expression, and they're still nullified before him in many meaningful ways. Nevertheless, they are, to some extent, an independent existence. They're incommensurate to his. I shouldn't say they're independent existence. They're incommensurate to his essence. They're infinitely removed from God himself. Even though they're bottled to God, even though they're nullified to him. Shehu Havaya Pshuta, because he is a simple existence. God is one and totally unified, and here you have 10 spheres and 10 different things. This itself is a massive limitation and an indication that you're not talking about God himself. You're talking about some form of expression of the Creator. Right? Questions so far? I mean, other than all the general ones, but on what we're speaking, what we're talking about, Okay, you see where I am inside? I'm 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 lines down on page 183.
Well, I thought Chachma was one of the expressions.
It is, correct.
So you also consider it as the expression of God, which contains all the spheres.
No. The highest of the 10 spheres, I said, was Chachma, but I said that each of the 10 spheres also has within it Chachma. Each of the 10 spheres has within it all of the other ones as well. So in other words, the bittul of Chachma is Chachma of Chachma, but the bittul of everything else is the Chachma of that thing, and to some extent, right? That's all I meant. They're all nullified before God, but nevertheless, they're all incommensurate to God. They are created through the tzimtzum. They are created through a removal of his light. Mina v'aziv, from the ray that's left over, as we said before. Ve'inyan tzimtzum zeh hu hipuch me'inyan ishtalshlus ilu v'alu. This tzimtzum, we're explaining why are these vessels limited.
It's not easy.
What?
It's not easy. This sentence is like 25 minutes of talking.
We're explaining, so why? The question now becomes why. That's the implied question. The implied question is why. Why are these vessels, first of all, why have these vessels, which are incommensurate to his essence? And why are they incommensurate to his essence? How did you get 10 from 1? How did this take place? It was through the tzimtzum. And the tzimtzum is not like illa va'alu. Illa va'alu means cause and effect. Cause and effect is there's several good evening. There's several processes of causation that God has and that God expresses himself. Ways in which God causes things to be or causes the world to be. So one of them is cause and effect, is illa va'alu. Cause and effect is what takes place below the world of Atzilus, generally speaking. Generally speaking, we say that below the highest of the spiritual worlds, everything is created in a process of cause and effect. One thing gives birth to the next. You can think of cause and effect like a lineage, right? Father and son. Everything, or like a chain, which is why the process is called Seder Ishtalshalos, the interlinking order of the worlds, right? Something like that. So it's translated where each level, each spiritual reality is given birth to and created directly by the reality that comes before it, right? So, for example, the Seichel gives birth to the Midas, right? Chachma and Bina create and give birth to the Midas, the emotional traits that are in the spheres, and they cause them directly in a direct causal relationship. This tzimtzum that we're describing now is not a description of a direct causal relationship. Right? It's not like the whole idea of the tzimtzum, the whole idea of the light is contracted, is that God does not cause these vessels to be directly. Shebeishtalshalos is anyone with me, even vaguely?
Yes.
Shebeishtalshalos, no one in the back is with me, even remotely. Shebeishtalshalos, hareha alul hu'erech ha'ila. Within the worlds, the effect is commensurate, is relative, has a relative relationship to the cause, right? For example, you can only, let's say, right? That's actually a silly example. I'm not gonna, hopefully no one will catch why it's a silly example, so we'll just try and pull it off anyway. You can't throw a baseball with more power than you already have in your arm, right? There's only a certain amount of power you have. You throw the baseball with the power in your arm, and the baseball goes a certain speed, right? And it goes however far it goes. And this is the cause and effect, right? Everything is commensurate. The effect is commensurate to the cause. You can't throw the baseball to Jupiter with the power that's in your arm, right? That's just not going to happen. You don't have the power that's necessary. The cause can only be relative to the effect within the worlds. This is one thing that distinguishes the four worlds from what exists higher than the four worlds. That within the four worlds, within nature, basically, even spiritual nature, within everything that we basically understand, and we know you can't have an infinite effect from a finite cause, right? There's always or vice versa, right? There's always a commensurate relationship between cause and effect. מה שכתוב ברמ"ק, הנה השתלשלות ובאול וכן בזוהר הקדוש פרשת בראשית. הנה בהשתלשלות הספירוס בספירוס עצמן, מה שאין כן זבוס מקהלה מן צו ברוך הוא. Okay, so then there's sort of a parenthetical statement here that the Ramak seems to imply that the vessels are created in a way of cause and effect, but the Tzemach Tzedek saying that's really only the way the spheres are created one from the other, not the way that they're created from God's infinite light. The point is that the vessels which are limited, even though they're bottled to God, you have to have both of these things. You have to understand both. Even though they're bottled to God and totally express Him and are an expression of God, nevertheless, they are limited creations, and what makes them limited is the process of the tzimtzum, is the process of God contracting His light, because it is not God's infinitude and His infinite power creating the vessels directly, rather the vessels are created from, there's a break. It's not a cause and effect, there's something else in the middle, right? This is what we call creation something from nothing, right? Yesh ma'ayin. There's a break in the causal chain, right? This is not me throwing a baseball. This is a baseball appears out of nowhere, right? Which we can barely even imagine, right? And certainly not imagine in any logical sense, right? Nevertheless, God has the ability to do this. That something can simply be, almost as if it's uncaused. Right? So what does God do? God limits His infinite light, and the vessels are created from something that is left over. They're not created directly from the infinite light. There's a break. They so to speak, are created from the remnant, from the tzimtzum.
That's what the Ramak said. It can be created from the makor of the makor.
Say again.
It has to be a limited light, otherwise it would become exactly what it was before it was created.
Right. Ilu, as we say here,
is the light limited, or the receiver is limited to what they can receive?
No, the light is infinite. In order to even create a receiver, the light is infinite. In order to even create a receiver, the light has to be removed. That's what we're saying. The light is removed. The receiver cannot be created from the infinite light itself, right? As we're going to explain at the bottom of page 182. If he were to express his light in a way of cause and effect, and simply create the vessels directly from it, from his vaziv, even from his light. Page 185. It would be impossible for Chachma, for the highest of the Spheros, to be created. Even the Chachma of the highest world. Because it is the source of human intellect, created through thousands upon thousands of descents, of lowering, coming through thousands and thousands of lowered levels. Through being invested in the 10 spheres of Asiyah, of the lowest worlds. In other words, ultimately, Chachma of Atzilus is the source of the human Chachma, of the Chachma that's in the human soul. The Eich Shatia Daka Men Adaka, Kameshi Yitzir Dakas Mesichas Aseichel Legab Mesichas Atapuach, the Ken Yitzar Mailis Shini Mahus Chachma Hanal, Ma Chachmas Debiyah, Afalpikin Ene Be'erech Ha'er HaPashat Hanal. Elal Idei Tzimtzum Atzum Daika, Shushinim Mahus Lamahus. Even though so it's like this, right? It's like this. You have God, you have His infinite light. The infinite light, there's a break, there's a tzimtzum. The light is removed. The light is stopped. All that's left over is something which is incommensurate to what was there before, right? Whatever it means that it was left over. So from this incommensurate thing that remains, right? The question is now, this thing that remains, what relationship does it have to God and His infinite light as they are naturally? Right? The answer is that the relationship that they have is that they're incommensurate. They're not. There's no comparison. It's not like the difference between 1 and a million. It's like the difference between a million and infinity, right? Where there is no connection between them. You could add one and not be any closer. You could subtract one and not be any further away, right? It's at a different plane. It's not more or less. It's something different, right? It's a different type of thing. It's infinite in a sense. It's infinitely lower.
God and this thing that the light left.
Yes, the God's infinite light and the Rishim, which becomes the source for the vessels of Atzilus, right? And he's saying, how do we know? Because the vessels of Atzilus ultimately are the source for everything in this world. The vessel of Chachma, the vessel of God, of the supernal intellect of Atzilus, is the source at a very, very distant remove from the human intellect, from the human Chachma, the Chachma that's in the human spirit. And even though we know that Chachma is very distant from us, right? Like the example he mentions it here, and this example is brought by the Alter Rebbe in his Maimarim as well, right? Like how do you understand even what Chesed of Atzilus is? So you would say, well, we know that there's a sweetness in an apple, right? And we know that there's a sweet person, and we know that there's a sweet idea, and all of these things, even though they're one is physical and one is emotional and one is intellectual, right? They're all sweet. There's something about them. They have the same makeup. There's something about them that makes them sweet. So too, if you kept extrapolating upwards and upwards in a more and more refined way, you would eventually reach the sweetness of Atzilus, Chesed of Atzilus, right? So too with Chachma, right? If you take the human intellect and you realize that there's something called Chachma, and you were able to abstract away many, many, many levels, you could theoretically come to an understanding of Chachma of Atzilus, right? The very fact that even though you can do that, and we realize that our Chachma is not like the Chachma of Atzilus, that the Chachma of Atzilus is something that's very abstract. Nevertheless, it is still incommensurate to the original infinite light of God. So in other words, we are very distant and many levels removed from the Chachma of Atzilus, which in turn is infinitely lower and infinitely removed from the original, God's infinite light from which it was originally created. Right? Ela al yedei tzimtzum atzum daika. It is only created through an awesome tzimtzum, an awesome contraction of God's light, which changes something not just in amount, not just quantitatively, but qualitatively, from one essence to another. In other words, the tzimtzum of God's life essentially created something new that wasn't there before. The tzimtzum, when the light is removed, what's left over is something new. It's not like God's light. It is basically creation, almost like something from nothing. So that's the one half, right? And we have to understand, as I've said in all these classes, we have to understand we're working both sides of the equation. That's why we seem to be of a split mind about these spheres of Atzilus. Are they one with God, or are they limited? Right? We keep going back and forth. They're one with God, but they're limited. They're limited, but they're one with God. Right? So we just explained the end that they're limited. Right? The vessels of Atzilus are not godly. They're completely incommensurate, it would seem, to God's infinite light, right? Now we have to do the other side. Amnam, page 184. Amnam, afalpike nikraim akelim halalu elikus. Nevertheless, these vessels are still called godliness. They're not a separate creation. Despite everything we just said, that we understand that they're limited, and they're defined, they don't reflect God's oneness, they're what's left over after the tzimtzum, they're what's left over after God's light is taken away. Nevertheless, they are still godliness, which as we remember, godliness is this fundamental, very important third category that exists between the Creator and the creation. There's something else. There's a third realm called godliness, which is an expression of God that is not a separate creation. And these vessels are still that, even though they are at a remove from God's infinite oneness. They are not separate or an independent creation. Like, for example, the kindness of the angel Michael, the angel Michael. Right? As we know, the angels reflect, as Chassidus and Kabbalah explain, the angels reflect the nature of the spheres. Different angels reflect different spheres, right? You have Gavriel, his name has the word Gvura in it, right? Gavriel is on the side of God, of severity, right? He is the angel, the judging angel, right? Then you have Michael's on the side of Chesed, the side of kindness, right? So what is the difference between the angel Michael, what makes him an angel, as opposed to the sphera of chesed, as opposed to God's sphera of kindness, right? So you have an angel of kindness and a sphera of kindness. What's the difference, right? You have two basically spiritual entities that are described in the Kabbalah. What's the difference between them? The difference is fundamental. Michael, the angel, is a separate, has an independent existence from God. Michael has an identity. Michael has an identity separate from the Creator. He is a separate spiritual existence. He simply desires God. Mishteket is like more than desire. It's like he thirsts for God. He desperately desires to become nothing. He craves God. He desires to become nothing in unity with the Creator, which, as we find out, is much of what the angels...
That's a contradiction.
What's a contradiction?
What you just said.
Why?
Say it again. Say what you said.
Well, he craves unity with the Creator.
Yeah, and then you said?
What did I say?
He desires to become nothing with the Creator.
Yes, he desires to become nothing, correct.
Yeah.
That is what he desires, absolutely. That is what basically almost all spiritual beings that are separate from God desire. If they know the Creator, they desire to become one with the Creator, which means losing their independence.
That part's fine.
Losing their independent existence, become nothing from the Creator. The reason why he is created entirely separately, and so too all of the creations, because their light is concealed within them, by God's gvura, by God's severity. Okay, what's the difference between the angel Michael and the sphera of God's kindness? What we call God's kindness, God's means of expressing himself kindly. The difference between the angel and the sphera is that the angel has an independent existence from God. The sphera does not. The sphera is not independent. The sphera is godliness itself. Right? What's the difference? What makes one an independent creation and one makes it godliness itself? In one, the God's light and life is revealed. In one, the light is concealed. Again, in one, the light is revealed. In another, the light is concealed. Why is it concealed? In order that the creation should see itself as a separate entity. Even though before him, he is of no importance. Right? So for example, good example. You have a
An example of what exactly?
I need the example to tell you.
Let's give that outline.
If you have, let's say you have an author, right? The author writes a story. And the story has a main character, yeah. The story has a protagonist. The protagonist becomes self-aware and realizes that he's within a story.
Realizes what?
He becomes self-aware and he realizes that he's within a story. This is very postmodern. Many such novels have been written recently. The protagonist realizes that he's within a novel. He desires, if he truly understands what it means that the author lives in a higher level of reality from himself, he desires to leave the story, right? He desires to become one. Really, the example is even in our reality, right? Like, for example, you could say maybe a child who wants to go out and join adult society, right? When you realize that your source exists in a much higher way than you do, right? You desire very much to break free of your boundaries and exist at that higher plane, right? Now, the thing is, right? The character, let's say you can write about it, and you write about it in a book, and that's where the character, so to speak, exists. What about the character as he exists when he's still in the author's mind, before even the story is written, right? The character that exists when he's still in the author's mind has no objective, separate reality from God whatsoever. From the author whatsoever. I'm getting into the analog already. He has no separate existence from the author whatsoever, right? When it's still within the author's mind, this is a metaphor I made up on the spot, right? So don't expect it to be too good. But when the character is still within the mind of the author, the character has no independent existence whatsoever. You cannot objectively share a thought with someone, right? So there is no perspective from which he exists when he's still within the mind of the author. He hasn't spoken about it to anyone, right? Speaking itself is a form of contraction, is a form of tzimtzum, right? The character exists only in my mind, and I haven't spoken it or communicated it to you in any way whatsoever, right? In what sense does this character exist separate from my mind? And the answer is in some very, very subtle sense, which is hard to discern, right? If you were to visit my mind, you would have trouble even distinguishing that this character is a being of its own. You would just see more and more of my mind. You would see more and more of myself and my further conception. This is what it means that the creation. This is what it means for something to still be bottled to the light, right? Now, so what's the next step in this example? The next step in this example is, now what if there was no character at all? What if you were looking at myself as I simply am in my own mind, right? Let's say there's 3 levels, right? There's three levels. This is getting better and better all the time. There's the author, as he is to himself in his own mind. His self-conception. When the author says I, what he refers to, right? That is within his mind somewhere, so to speak. There is a character that he creates as it's within his mind before he communicates it to anyone. And then there's a character that he writes about that the whole world reads about in a bestseller, right? Right? The character that he creates within his mind is incommensurate to his sense of self. He existed before he created the character. He'll exist after he created the character. The character is merely an expression of himself, right? The character is basically just one tiny act of he himself as he exists, right? What's the character's relationship to the author himself? Basically as nothing, right? Totally incommensurate. Nevertheless, when it's still within his mind, when it's not communicated to anyone, it's still bottled to him. It's still totally subjugated to him in a way that you can't distinguish between the character and his mind. He hasn't communicated it to anyone. Where does the character exist? What is the character? The character is simply part of his mind. There's no distinction to draw between the two. Once the character becomes objective, once he removes himself and there's something lower, the character as an objective thing now, so to speak, takes on a life of its own. Even though it still comes from him, and even though the character could still desire to break free, so to speak, right? If the character became self-aware, it's a bit of a stretch of the mashal at that point, but a stretch of the analogy. But the point is that the character now has an independent existence. Why is it an independent existence? Because the character is not only made up of your own mind anymore. The character is now in letters. The character has a means by which, a canvas upon which he's expressed. That's not within your mind, right? Everyone understand the analogy, the three levels of the analogy. Right? There's the author, the character as it's within his mind, the character as he expresses it on paper. What is this a metaphor for? Is the three levels we're discussing today, so far. There's God and his infinite light, which is his conception of himself. That's the author himself, so to speak. Right? The character, which is like the vessels of Atzilus. It is the mind. It is, so to speak, the light coming down to be one specific thing. Right, is incommensurate to the light itself, right? The character is incommensurate to the author himself, right? It's just one character, it's one thing that's been created out of all that infinite light. It has a defined existence. It's at a totally different plane. It doesn't become a real person just by thinking about it. The author is the real person. This is a little doll that he creates inside of his mind, yeah? Nevertheless, where is the sphera found? What is the sphera? The sphera is only an expression of the light of his mind. That's all the sphera is. It's not like a character that's been told to anyone else or written down. It's within his own mind. That's what the sphera of chesed is. The sphera of chesed, God's own kindness, even though it's incommensurate to him and incommensurate to his infinite light, nevertheless, it's because it's bottled, because that's ultimately going to be the answer, because it's transparent to the light that shines in it, the light of God that shines within it, it's still part and parcel of his being. It's part of his mind, even though it's not he himself. Even though it's his kindness, right? It's a very rough metaphor because I just made it up. I want to continue emphasizing. Take with a grain of salt. The angel Michael is like the character that's been written out and becomes a bestseller. It's also an expression of God's kindness. In fact, it's a reflection of the same character he was thinking about to himself. But now the character's very being is no longer the mind of the author. The being has been separated out. It has a new creation. Once it's on paper, now anyone can have it. Now anyone can access it. Now it's in the objective realm. It's no longer part of his mind. It's part of the world. It has a separate existence. It's created. It's like something from nothing. Actually, it's in the world of Bria. He's an angel. He's created. He's a separate. He goes out into the world. He's no longer part and parcel of my mind. You can't point to the character and say, what am I pointing at? I'm pointing at God's mind. You're pointing at the character. You could just be pointing at a page. Right? Even though, where do the words on the page come from? They come from God's mind. What's the character based on? It's based on the concept in the author's mind. Nevertheless, it's taken on a separate existence. This is basically the difference, very roughly, between the kindness of Atzilus and the angel of Michael. The kindness of Atzilus is bottled to God. It's still part of that expression. It has no independent existence from his light and from his expression. The angel Michael has, to an extent, an independent existence. Even though the independent existence is based on and comes from and desires to return to the author's mind, so to speak, it would be in the metaphor. Nevertheless, he's a separate existence. This is basically the different levels we're describing here. And nevertheless, the kindness of Atzilus is totally incommensurate to God himself, right? The character is totally removed from the author. The author is totally at a different level than the character that he creates, right? I don't know if that's literally true in a human being, that the author is infinitely removed, right? Probably the mind of the author and his self-conception, I'm not sure if it's infinitely removed. Maybe the essence of the soul, you could say the essence of the soul is removed from the character in the author's mind, whatever.
It is, because you can perceive it completely different than what he had in his mind.
No, that's not the point. The point is whether the author is completely incommensurate to the character in his mind. That's the... מה שאין כן בכלים הנ"ל, שאין מהוס החכמה אלא בשם בריאה בפני עצמי חס ושלום. As opposed to the vessels, as we spoke about before, that the being of Chachma is not called an independent creation. In other words, the vessels of Atzilus are not considered creations. They're in the third realm. They're godliness and not separate creations. Why not? Because they are batal to his light. Because they are nullified before God, basically they have no independent existence. They have a completely dependent existence. As opposed to the angel, which is an objective, separate reality, that nevertheless is still pretty batal to Hashem. Right? Compared to anything in our world, is unbelievably batal to Hashem. Right? Nevertheless, it's still a separate existence.
It's like the angel's a free agent.
He's not free. He's not free in any way, but he's a separate creation. Angels don't have free will in Judaism. Ultimately, Chachma, the spheres of Atzilus, are godliness, are literally godliness. And when we say Chachma, when we say wisdom, the wisdom of Atzilus, we actually are referring to God's wisdom itself. It is referred to as, it is so unified with God that it can be considered God's wisdom. So to his bina, his das, and his chesed, other spheres. He contracts. It is simply a contraction of his light to shine in a limited way. That there should be chachma and chesed. So we're basically explaining the source from the other end now. We explained before how they're totally incommensurate to God, and they're not considered one with Him, and they're separate because they're separate to an extent because they're defined, and there's 10 of them, and they're limited. On the other hand, we see that they are one with the Creator, right? They're not separate existences. They're totally batal. This is the balance of the spheres. This is what makes them important, so to speak, because they are the meeting point. They're the meeting point between Hashem and the creation. And they are so, yes, okay. Okay. In order to influence through these powers, through his different spheres, to so to speak, to put the influence of his godliness and convey his godly reality into the world, in order that the world should exist in their present state. So, what's the purpose of having these spheres, right? So that whole discussion is a discussion of how are the spheres not the same as God's infinite light? They're created through a tzimtzum, right? They're incommensurately lower, even though they are an expression of God still, and they are created from His light, etc., right? There's this balance. What's the point of having the spheres, so to speak? What do they accomplish? They allow Him to express godliness within the world. They allow there to be such a thing as a world, and for those worlds to have to be an expression of God. And that is what we're going to discuss next week, God willing. Are there any questions? I think this is a very difficult class for some of us present.
I understand your muscle. I understand what you're saying as far as the thought, Silas, and then the character would be Michael.
Yes.
But the same, I'd struggle with Michael being in any way without free choice.
Yeah.
Character of independence.
He's not really. He's not. He has an independent. He's an independent consciousness. The point is not that he has free will. The point is that he has an independent sense of I. He has an independent sense of self.
Separate from the...
Yes. Like an animal. The angels are called animals in Judaism, the holy animals, right? So too, there's many similarities between angels and animals. One of the similarities is that animals also have consciousness, right? To some extent. The angels also have a sense of I. They have a sense of self to some extent. Not like a person, but to some extent, right? Even though they don't have free will in the sense that we say human beings have free will, right? In other words, they're not able to assess. They have an independent sense of self. They have a subjective reality. They say there's an I there. There's someone there. There's someone in there, right? As anyone with a pet can tell you, there's someone in there. There's a personality. There's a being in there. There's an independent, subjective being, subjective consciousness, right? Like in an animal, so too with an angel. Obviously, an angel has this more than a human does. An animal has less than a human does. An animal has a very holy, an angel has a very holy and a very refined, yet still subjective experience. The angel has a sense of I. The spheres do not have a sense of I. The spheres are totally bottled to God's light, which means that when God says I, he actually refers to the spheres as well. Even though the spheres are not really at the level of I, of the same level of I as this infinite light. They're at a removed level, right? He can have both. Basically, God cheats and he can have both. He can have something which he calls I, but which is nevertheless limited, almost like something within the world, right? It's limited and defined. That's the whole point. That's the whole accomplishment of this whole system. The whole accomplishment of doing it this way is that you have something which is able to eventually become a limited and defined universe that is nevertheless totally united with God. That's the whole point. That's the whole thrust of this long discussion. That's what we're aiming for.